5 seconds. That was the length of time. The world stood still in the glass palace. Behind the bulletproof doors of the VIP lounge, 12 men held their breath, their hands hovering over concealed holsters. They weren't looking at the rival boss across the table. They were looking at the toddler with curly hair and a mismatched sweater, who had just reached out and grabbed the pinky finger of Jae-hoon Kwang, the most feared man in Korea. Jae-hoon, known as the Obsidian for his inability to feel or break, didn't move. He didn't signal his guards to remove the stain from his presence. Instead, his cold, predatory eyes tracked the child's tiny fingers as they traced the scars on his knuckles. In that silence, the club's server, Amara, felt her soul leave her body. She had spent 2 years being invisible, scrubbed floors, and surviving the shadows, all to protect the secret she held in that coat closet. Now, the secret was holding the hand of a monster. And before I tell you why the most dangerous man in Seoul didn't pull his hand away, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next didn't just break the rules of the syndicate, it shattered the man who wrote them. If you believe the invisible still matter, and that brilliance can rise from the darkest corners, even the coldest hearts can learn to love again, subscribe. And let's know where you're watching from. The glass palace was a misnomer. It wasn't made of glass. It was made of reinforced, one-way acrylic, and the crushed dreams of people who thought they could outsmart the house. Located 6 floors beneath the glittering pavement of Gangnam, it was the private playground of the Iron Lotus Syndicate. Here, the air was thick with the scent of Davidoff cigars, $1,000 scotch, and the silent, vibrating tension of men who played with millions like it was pocket change. Amara moved through this world like a ghost. At 26, she was a woman of striking, obsidian beauty, her Nigerian heritage lending her a regal stature that she spent every waking hour trying to shrink. She was an undocumented immigrant, a shadow in a city that demanded a paper trail for everything from a SIM card to a loaf of bread. To the men in the tailored Italian suits, she wasn't Amara. She was Server 4, a pair of hands that refilled crystal tumblers and cleared away silver ashtrays without ever making eye contact. Her life was a clockwork of terror. Every shift started with the same ritual, sneaking her 3-year-old son, Zane, through the service entrance hidden inside a laundry bin. The VIP coat closet, a windowless room filled with fur coats and leather jackets, was Zane's nursery. It was a small, cramped space that smelled of expensive perfume and mothballs, but for Amara, it was the only safe harbor in a hostile sea. "Stay small, my little lion," she would whisper, pressing her forehead against his. "No sound. No matter what you hear, you stay behind the coats." Zane, with his cloud of curly hair and eyes that seemed to absorb every scrap of light in a room, would simply nod. He was a child of the silence. He had learned early that in Seoul, a black child's laughter was a siren that brought the police, and his cries were a debt his mother couldn't pay. On this particular Tuesday, the tension in the palace was different. It wasn't just gambling, it was a summit. Jae-hoon, the Obsidian Kwang, was at the head of the table. He was a man carved from the very stone he was named after, cold, sharp, and seemingly indestructible. He didn't speak often, but when he did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amara's hands shook as she approached the table to refill Jae-hoon's water. She could feel the heavy presence of his guards, men whose eyes scanned for threats with mechanical precision. She kept her head down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She just needed 2 more hours. 2 more hours of being invisible, and she could take her son back to their tiny, one-room apartment. But as she turned to leave, she noticed the door to the coat closet, the door she had triple-checked, was standing a half-inch ajar. A cold sweat broke across her neck. A fur coat was swinging slightly, as if something or someone had just pushed past it. Her secret wasn't just out. It was walking onto the most dangerous floor in South Korea. The silence in the glass palace was usually a sign of respect, but tonight it was a prelude to a storm. Jae-hoon Kwang sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the cards held by a rival boss who was trying to bluff his way into a shipping monopoly. Amara stood frozen by the service station, her breath hitching as she watched a small, curly-haired shadow emerge from the fur coats. Zane didn't run. He didn't cry. He moved with a curious, rhythmic grace, his eyes locked onto the colorful chips and the shifting patterns of the cards. Every guard in the room shifted, hands instinctively reaching for their holsters. To them, an unknown movement was a threat to be neutralized. But before a single word could be barked, Zane reached the Obsidian himself. With the fearless innocence of a 3-year-old, he reached up and wrapped his tiny hand around Jae-hoon's pinky finger. The room went deathly silent. Jae-hoon looked down, his face a mask of predatory stillness. Amara's knees nearly gave way. She expected a shove, a shout, or worse, but Jae-hoon didn't move. He watched as Zane pointed a small finger at the rival boss's hand and whispered a single word in his limited Korean, "Bipal gang, red." Jae-hoon's gaze snapped to the rival, then back to the child. The rival boss flinched, his composure breaking. Zane had identified the suit of the hidden card just by watching the way the man's pulse throbbed in his neck. The Obsidian didn't call the guards. Instead, he allowed the child to keep holding his finger, a faint, dangerous spark of interest flickering in his cold eyes. The forgotten child had just seen a pattern the most powerful men in the room had missed. 24 hours later, Amara found herself not in a police station or a deportation center, but in the penthouse of the Lot World Tower. The space was a masterpiece of cold marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking a Seoul that looked like a toy set from this height. Director Han had summoned them not to punish them, but because he realized that Zane was a biological miracle, a child with a natural, photographic memory for encryption and patterns. "You were cleaning my floors while your son was cracking my security codes," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal glasses on the table hum. He stood by the window, his back to her. "The Iron Lotus doesn't throw away assets, and I don't throw away things that belong to me." Amara clutched Zane's hand, her heart caught between relief and a new, sharper kind of terror. "We aren't assets, Director. We are people." Jae-hoon turned, his eyes tracking the way Zane was already arranging the expensive decorative stones on the coffee table into a perfect Fibonacci sequence. "In this city, Amara, you are only a person if you have a protector. From today, you have me." He issued a decree that sent shockwaves through the syndicate. The basement server and her illegal child were now under his personal protection. He provided them with a suite adjacent to his own, stocked with everything from educational tablets to the finest silks. But as Amara looked at the high-tech locks on the doors, she wondered if they had truly been saved, or if they had simply moved from a small closet into a much larger, more expensive cage. The most dangerous weapon in Seoul wasn't a gun or a blade. It was the eyes of a 3-year-old child. As Jae-hoon Kwang, a man who had never felt the warmth of another human, looked down at the tiny hand clutching his own, he realized his empire was no longer the most important thing in the room. He was a man built to destroy, but for the first time in 15 years, he found something he was willing to die to protect. Life in the penthouse was a study in contradictions. Jae-hoon, a man who spoke in commands, found himself fascinated by a child who barely spoke at all. While the city slept, the Obsidian would sit in his leather armchair, watching Zane play on the floor. The boy didn't play with toys, he played with the world. He would take Jae-hoon's complex ledger books, encrypted codes that baffled international banks, and point to the discrepancies with a small, steady finger. "You see it, don't you?" Jae-hoon whispered one night, leaning in. He wasn't talking to a toddler, he was talking to an equal. Zane simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the security monitors. Amara watched from the doorway, her heart aching. She saw the way Jae-hoon's posture relaxed when Zane was near, the way his hand, usually clenched into a fist, would soften to pat the boy's head. It was a dangerous game. In the Iron Lotus, soft was synonymous with dead. Jai-hoon was teaching Zane the language of power, but Zane was teaching the Obsidian something far more terrifying, the language of love. The cold, black stone of Jai-hoon's heart was beginning to thaw, and in the underworld, ice that melts becomes a flood. But the glass palace had ears, and the walls of the syndicate were built with eyes. Chairman Oh, a man who had waited 10 years for Jai-hoon to blink, noticed the change. He saw the way the Iron Lotus boss began to skip late-night summits to return to the penthouse. He saw the undocumented server who now wore designer silk and stood by Jai-hoon's side during private briefings. "The Obsidian has found a heartbeat," Oh sneered to his lieutenants in a smoke-filled room in Incheon. "And a heartbeat is just a target." Oh didn't care about the child's genius or the woman's beauty. He saw a pressure point. For years, Jai-hoon had been untouchable because he loved nothing and feared nothing. Now he had a family, a word that was a death sentence in their world. Oh began to move his pieces, bribing the penthouse security team and planting trackers in the very laundry bins Amara once used to hide her son. The trap was being set, not for the boss, but for the boy who had made the boss human. The countdown to the Glass Palace siege had begun. Jai-hoon Kwang had been shot, stabbed, and betrayed, and he had never once blinked. But as the first bullet shattered the reinforced glass of his penthouse, his heart did something it hadn't done in decades. It skipped a beat. For the first time, the Obsidian wasn't fighting for territory or power. He was fighting for a 3-year-old boy who was still clutching a drawing he'd made for the man the world called a monster. The attack began at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't a loud explosion but a surgical strike. Chairman O's mercenaries, disguised as a high-end maintenance crew, had bypassed the external sensors. The power to the Lot World Tower penthouse cut out, plunging the marble halls into a rhythmic, emergency red pulse. Jai-hoon was in his study, staring at a complex shipping manifest, when the silence was replaced by the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed submachine guns. His survival instincts, honed in the back alleys of Busan, took over instantly. He didn't reach for his phone. He reached for the Glock 17 hidden beneath the desk and moved toward the nursery. Inside, Amara had already pulled Zane from his bed, her body shielding his small frame in the corner of the room. Zane was wide-eyed, his tiny hands gripping his mother's silk robe, but he remained eerily silent, a child of shadows who knew that noise meant discovery. "Under the bed, now," Jai-hoon commanded as he slid into the room. As the nursery door was kicked off its hinges, Jai-hoon didn't hide. He stepped into the line of fire. He took a bullet to the shoulder to ensure the mercenary's aim didn't drift toward the corner where the boy lay. The Obsidian fought with a cold, desperate ferocity the attackers hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just a boss protecting an asset. He was a father protecting his soul. By the time the hallway cleared, Jai-hoon was bleeding, but Zane was untouched. The message was clear. To get to the child, they would have to kill a king. The aftermath of the siege was a bloodbath of a different kind. Jai-hoon didn't go to the hospital. He sat in his blood-stained chair while a private medic stitched his shoulder. He watched Zane, who had crawled out from under the bed and was now sitting on the floor, curiously touching the discarded brass shell casings. "They think they found a weakness," Jai-hoon whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. Amara stood behind him, her hands trembling as she cleaned the soot from Zane's face. Jai-hoon realized that as long as they were shadows, undocumented and unofficial, they were targets. The Iron Lotus Syndicate functioned on the perception of power. If he hid them, he was weak. If he displayed them as his own, he was untouchable. He began the cleansing. In 48 hours, every traitor who had taken Chairman O's money was found. Jai-hoon didn't just eliminate them, he ensured the underworld knew why. He walked into a meeting of the 7 high chairs with Zane sitting on his hip, the boy's small hand resting on the Obsidian's scarred neck. He wasn't hiding his family anymore. He was using them as his shield. He made it known. The boy was the heir to the Iron Lotus. To touch him was to declare war on the very foundation of Seoul. Money can buy a name, but blood can only be protected by the law of the land. As Jae-hoon Kwang sat in a room filled with the most powerful lawyers in South Korea, he wasn't signing a merger or a deed. He was signing a life. For 15 years, he had been the Obsidian, a man with no past and no future. But as he looked at the toddler who called him Papa in a language the world didn't understand, he realized that $1 billion was worthless if it couldn't keep a child safe. The transition from the underworld to the upper world required a different kind of violence, the cold, clinical execution of legal paperwork. Jae-hoon realized that protection in the streets was temporary, but protection in the courts was permanent. He summoned a team of elite attorneys to the penthouse, the air thick with the scent of expensive ink and the quiet shuffling of adoption papers. Amara watched, her heart in her throat, as the Obsidian used his immense wealth to forge a new reality. He didn't just provide Zane with a visa, he provided him with a lineage. By the time the sun set over the Han River, the Shadow Child had a new name, Zane Kwang. He was no longer a server's secret. He was the legally recognized heir to the Iron Lotus fortune. But Jae-hoon didn't stop at the child. He knew that for Zane to be truly safe, his mother had to be untouchable. He established a charitable foundation in Amara's name, turning the shadow server into a prominent philanthropist overnight. He was effectively building a fortress of legitimacy around them. As Zane sat on the floor, using the high-priced fountain pens to draw circles on a discarded draft, Jae-hoon realized he was no longer a man who ruled through fear alone. He was a man who ruled to preserve a future he never thought he'd have. 10 years later, the glass palace had been demolished, replaced by a gleaming architectural marvel known as the Kwang Tower. Jae-hoon stood on the top floor, his hair graying at the temples but his posture as sharp as ever. Beside him stood Zane, now 13, possessing the same piercing intelligence and calm demeanor that had once saved them both. The Iron Lotus was no longer a syndicate of shadows. It was a global empire of technology and innovation. Jae-hoon had stayed true to his promise. He had traded the Glock for the boardroom, the knife for the contract. He looked at Amara, who now walked the halls of the city with her head held high, no longer shrinking from the light. "You saved him," Amara whispered, joining Jae-hoon at the window. Jae-hoon looked at his son, who was currently analyzing a complex data stream on a holographic display. He felt the warmth in his chest, the place where the cold obsidian had finally, completely shattered. "No," Jae-hoon replied, his voice soft but steady. "I merely provided the steel. He was the one who taught me that a king is only as strong as the people he protects. I didn't save him, Amara. He saved me from becoming a ghost in my own empire." Jae-hoon Kwang began his journey as a monster who ruled through silence, and ended it as a father who lived for the light. It makes you ask yourself, if a man whose heart was made of stone could be changed by the touch of a child, what is stopping you from rewriting your own legacy? The final scene fades in on the rooftop of the Kwang Tower. The harsh, neon glare of the city below is softened by the rising sun, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Jae-hoon Kwang, no longer the Obsidian but a man reforged, stands with his hand on the shoulder of a teenage Zane. They aren't looking at a map of territory to conquer. They are looking at a horizon of possibilities they built together. Amara joins them, her presence no longer a secret but the very heart of the empire. The glass palace is gone, and in its place is a legacy that proves that the most powerful force in the world isn't fear, it's the courage to be seen. As the screen fades to black, the rhythmic ticking of a clock, once the sound of Zane's patterns, morphs into a steady human heartbeat. Every empire eventually falls, but a legacy of love stands forever. Jae-hoon Kwang spent his life building walls, only to realize that the most important thing he ever did was let a child climb over them. If this story reminded you that no one is truly invisible, and that even the hardest hearts can change, then you've found your home here. We tell stories of the marginalized becoming magnificent and the powerful finding their purpose. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join our community. Your support allows us to keep bringing these cinematic tales of resilience, justice, and unlikely family to life. Don't just watch the story. Be part of the movement that celebrates the brilliance hidden in the shadows. Question for the comments. If you were in Jae-hoon's position, would you have chosen the Empire or the child? I'll be in the comments reading your answers. Until next time, remember, stay brilliant and never stop looking for the light.